Here at the Architects of the New Paradigm Conference, I caught up with my friend Richard Dolan. Now, the subject of his new book is the history of false flags. It's a little bit outside of the ET realm, but it's some really frightening and interesting information. Normally, you're operating within the ET field, and as a historian, I know your interests are broader than that alone. And so you've got an upcoming project about false flags, and that's what you talked about here.
Yes.
I don't think people understand the depth of how far back that goes and how elaborate it's been. Give us a little primer on false flags.
By all means. False flag, for anyone who's not familiar, is simply, let's think of it as an act by typically a government or an intelligence agency, or maybe some other group as well, that is traumatizing, shocking in one way, could involve blowing up buildings or killing people, that is then blamed on another party. So these days we might say terrorists, or in the older days it might have been communists. And so my contention is that there's quite a lot of that going on in the world today. I believe that we live in an era of false flags. Now, you know, I have come to believe in the last year that I've been looking into this, that false flags in fact are a distinctively modern, not really an ancient phenomenon. There's been lies in the ancient world, there's been all kinds of cruelty and hierarchical control, without a doubt. But what we think of as a false flag, I now believe really truly came into its own during the 20th century.
Do you think that has to do with the increased ability to communicate? Because a false flag is not really going to be effective if you can't reach a huge amount of the populace.
Well, there's a couple of things. One is, to do a false flag well, you have to effectively dominate the means of propaganda, of disseminating your message. So, like the earliest really effective false flags of the 20th century, I look at the 1930s by Japan, Germany, and the Soviet Union. They had total state control over their media, and it was effective for them. And now today we have the United States, which has I think, a very dominant control over much of global media, not 100%, but very strong. So you need media control over the message and the narrative. You need very good covert op teams. This is important, so you have to have people who are trained and skilled and good at covering their tracks. So those two things right there. You need a lot of money, and you need a motivation as well to kind of transform national or global politics in a way. Not everyone can do that. And one of the other things that's important about a false flag is you need to have an ostensibly democratic society. In other words, you think of someone like Kim Jong-un in North Korea. He doesn't really need to do false flags on his population. And the reason is he has total domination over them. You know, he just does what he does, and that's the end of it.
So when you have a population totally subjugated, false flags aren't really in the toolbox.
That's, I think, my belief at this point. I think when you have a population that is ostensibly democratic, where people either believe in reality or in practice, or excuse me, in theory or in reality that they have rights, they have to be corralled. You have to manage public opinion. That's certainly the case in the U.S. Even though we're, I think, effectively an oligarchy. Anyway, nonetheless, public opinion is a major factor, of course, in U.S. politics and law. So here in the U.S. and in much of the rest of the world now, where governments and societies are ostensibly democratic, there have to be ways of manipulating them that are at times very extreme, and that's the false flag. I look at the false flag as a type of propaganda that falls along a spectrum. So it's not the only type of propaganda. There's, you know, news, censorship, and spin. There's cultural distractions like, you know, the Kardashians and Monday Night Football and what have you that keep us off the game into looking at distractions. Those things like that are typically able to account for most of the control that is needed. But every now and then you need more strong measures, whether they're various covert ops, regime change, or false flags, I think, are the ultimate tool in the toolbox.
Now, I know that you've gone through a history of false flags. That was your lecture and I guess the topic of your book. One thing that I found fascinating is that you've documented way more than we would ever imagine have occurred. Can you cite a couple that people might not really recognize or know to be false flags that you've uncovered?
Yeah, by all means. I think in the research I've done, I've looked at the last century at least 100 or probably a little bit more events that I would say are probable false flags. I want to emphasize researching a false flag is very tricky, and sometimes you're really not always going to have definitive knowledge. You have to use your best judgment. All right, there are certain things that seem to be in common with a lot of these false flags. Whether it's a changing narrative of what happened, or whether it's the idea of multiple drills, simultaneous drills going on, and a lot of other things. So there's a kind of profile, actually, of false flags. But it really comes down to whether proving it or not comes down to good journalism and investigation, and you're not really going to get too many admissions from governments that these happen. But having said that, there are some cases that are, we have major false flags, we have minor false flags. One that I think people ought to know about, and this is completely well documented, was a long-standing NATO-based operation in Europe during the Cold War known as Gladio. And Operation Gladio was initially formed by right after the Second World War ended. There was a concern or fear among Allied nations that the Red Army, the Russians, would roll over Western Europe. And so teams were left behind in places like Italy and elsewhere to act as a kind of resistance if that were to happen. Well, in fact, it didn't happen. The Russians didn't take over Italy, but there were teams there who thought, well, now what do we do? And these were all under NATO, they were all in communication and with NATO, under NATO control. And they ended up doing terrorist acts, blowing up train stations and killing people and blaming it on communists during the 1970s and 80s. And actually, no, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And a number of these now are absolutely confirmed, and a lot of the Gladio operators were arrested and imprisoned, and with full confessions. You can find a lot of this on YouTube and on the web. Gladio is a real and it's a devious, dastardly program. And the purpose of Gladio, in the words of one of the operatives himself, was that to force the Italian people, in this case, to run to the state for protection against the communists. So it was definitely a series of acts that were to influence domestic politics. There are a number of these types of bombings and other acts that have gone through really the Cold War, through the 20th century, and into our own. A lot of us will talk about 9/11 as a false flag, and that is certainly my belief. That, in other words, to talk about 9/11 as a false flag, you would say this was something that was done with the coordination of some part of the U.S. intelligence community, legally or not. I mean, obviously illegally. There's a lot of details about 9/11 that maybe we'll never all agree on, because we weren't part of the club to do it. There'll always be things. I would say that after 9/11, there are a number of cases of a piling on effect of other nations doing their own false flags as part of a way to get U.S. money for their war on terror. There is one in which the nation of Macedonia in 2002 was caught executing 7 illegal aliens in their country, I think from Pakistan, and saying that they were Al-Qaeda, which they were not. They were not Al-Qaeda at all. But the point was they wanted to say, well, we too are under terrorist threat, and let's get some U.S. Anti-terror money. And actually this, I think, happened in the case of Egypt in the early 2000s as well, and a number of other countries where to engage, to kind of create the alliance of the war on terror, these events happened. That's just one of a lot of these false flag events are just fascinating to go into. It's very disturbing. I would say that this is the single most disturbing topic I've ever looked at, and it is one of those things that'll keep you awake at night, because you start realizing just how deep and dark the structure of power is. And I think the most important thing people need to understand is why false flags are happening. The reason is it's not just one damn thing after another. The reason that they're happening is specific. It is because the United States in particular, which gets the gold medal for false flags in our world by far, is at a point where they are, and its power structure, are seeking to establish really total control over the global structure. And that includes regime change, that includes population control. Think of it this way. If you are deliberately exporting your entire manufacturing infrastructure to other nations where they work essentially for free, which has been the case in the U.S. for years, you need to control that population and keep them compliant. Because otherwise, in the days when Americans believed that they had rights, I remember those days, they would protest. This is famously what happened. I think the best example was Seattle in 1999, the WTO protests, in which those protesters shut that city down. And this is what happens when people realize that their entire livelihood is being taken away. So one of the key motivations for the false flags in our world today is to essentially have justification to enact certain laws, pernicious, draconian laws to take people's rights away and essentially beat them over the head with a big national security stick, which has been happening ever since 9/11. So that people in America learn, duck your head, don't speak up. If you want to protest, now you know your face will be triangulated, you'll go in a database. It's ruled by surveillance, ruled by intimidation. That is the United States today. This is not the United States 20 years ago. That still would have been outrageous to consider, but no longer. So 9/11 initiated a cultural change that has sadly beaten the belief of freedom out of a lot of people. And we have a whole generation now that's grown up in a post-9/11 world, and it's tragic. So domestic revolution's one key factor. And the other key factor in these false flags is that the United States is intent on maintaining for as long as possible the petrodollar system. This is my take on it anyway. And to explain what the petrodollar is might be a little long here, but it's essentially the United States' control over the exportation of oil, especially from the OPEC nations, using the dollar system. It's very important, and it maintains much of the profligate United States economic policies, because essentially it's holding the rest of the world hostage to the U.S.-based system. A lot of nations are pushing against that, and when they push against it enough, like Saddam Hussein did in 2000, they have to go. Or like Muammar Gaddafi did in 07, 08, 09, he had to go. It's a system, according to the U.S., I feel, that brooks no opposition. Now, they can't just go out and state this to the world or to their people, because it really is bad publicity. So the result is they have to lie, and they have to rule by deception and by lying. And the false flag, again, is a way to corral global opinion to support U.S. policies internationally as well as domestically. I guess what I'm trying to do is I think it's helpful that we have an analytical approach to understanding false flags, not simply looking at one and then another and then another. That's important too. We want to know what are the probable false flags, but I think more importantly we need to know why they're happening and what they typically look like and how we might be able to spot them better in the future, so we don't get hosed by the media and by the national security community that wants to take our rights away.
Let me ask you just one more question. There's a lot of people that talk about Project Bluebeam, which is the idea that there's going to be a false flag alien invasion. Now, I know that you've gone on the record as saying that you don't really support that that's really going to happen, but do you think that ever it was considered by people that actually had the ability to pull it off? Was it ever on the table?
I'm not aware of it in any kind of confirmed way that it was. There are certainly claims that this is the case, but I don't really have a lot of confidence in how authentic some of these claims are. The idea of Bluebeam is it's gone through permutations. It was originally conceived in the 1990s as a false second coming of Christ, not as an alien invasion, a false second coming, as a religious thing. In other words, that morphed after 2000 or so into this idea of an extraterrestrial invasion. So even the idea itself has gone through changes. I find it difficult to the idea would be to fake an alien invasion, scare the hell out of the population, and use that as an excuse to impose a global police state. I think that's the basic idea. Well, I would counter and just say this is what's happening very, very rapidly around us without any Project Bluebeam and needed. And the other thing is to make a Bluebeam idea work. The big obstacle, from my point of view, is simply, you might be able to fool certain numbers of the mass public, but there is a world filled with millions of scientists who are not only skeptical of UFOs but are deeply hostile to the idea, and for me to think they're simply going to roll over and blindly accept this idea without really looking into it, especially because the idea of Bluebeam is a fake alien invasion. So are you just going to pretend for one day that there are alien ships here, and then what do you do the next week and the week after that? Just they'll go away, and Do you know what I mean? Like there's
Sure, it makes a lot of sense.
Follow up to it, and I just think that it's a very a logistical nightmare. I can't really see. Now maybe this is a failure of my imagination. I guess I would say this though. So whereas I don't believe that this is a genuine false flag plan, I would say that if the government tomorrow were to state we're being invaded by aliens, my first instinct would be to say that that's a lie.
When is your book coming out?
Well, I'm working on it for 2016. Realistically, the later part of the year. That's if I'm efficient and I'm on my game. I'm doing the best I can.
What else does Richard Dolan Press have in the lineup this year?
Well, I'm a small-time publisher, and I publish my works and works by other very interesting authors, very, very interesting authors. So I just recently published a great book called The Messengers by a fellow named Mike Cleland, about owls and synchronicity and UFOs. And if you think that's a crazy topic, it seems crazy. He did a brilliant job with it. I'm about to publish a book on the history of Russian USOs, that is unidentified submersible objects, that I think by two authors that I think did a very good job. It's interesting. A couple of other projects by other authors off the top of my head. I'm a little more distant down the road. My own third volume of history of UFOs in the national security state will follow my false flag book.
So what's your website again?
It's richarddolanpress.com.
Richard, thanks for spending some time with me.
Thank you, Ron.
If you like what we're doing, subscribe here on YouTube. If you'd like to go deeper, see more original content, all commercial free, go to IvolveTV.com and become a subscriber. We're repurposing the purpose of media, and we want you to join us.